This week, moving on from oil.
They stand to lose somewhere, my guess would be on the order of $4 billion. All of that is kind of like the sunk cost of just trying to do the project.
Adapt or die. After the cancellation of the Keystone XL Pipeline is a multi-billion-dollar industry facing extinction.
I think more needs to be done to move the planet on to cleaner forms of energy. And we certainly, in Equinor, believe we're taking the lead on that.
Big oil becomes big energy. We speak to one of the first companies to publicly start the transition to renewables. But is it moving fast enough?
Thousands of wells in the Permian, tens of thousands. How many of those are going to collapse? Even if it's only 1%, that's 100 wells that are going to pollute aquifers and destroy huge swaths of land. And
millions of oil wells lie abandoned across the American South. Whose responsibility is it to clean up the mess? I'm Kaylee Lines in New York, and this is Bloomberg Green. The cancellation of the Keystone XL Pipeline, first by President Biden, then by the operator TC Energy, was a litmus test for the power of climate activism in the U.S. But it may also have marked a watershed moment for big oil. With the development of renewable energy accelerating, the pipeline business increasingly finds itself against the ropes. Could Keystone's cancellation actually be a death knell for a multi-billion-dollar industry?
There's no doubt that oil and gas made the world what it is today. Once reliant on foreign oil predominantly in the Middle East, the U.S. became closer to its perennial quest for energy independence within the last decade with advances in fracking.
About 10 years ago is the start of what we consider the shale revolution, and that's when we combined hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, and we just unleashed this record amount of U.S. oil and gas supply.
The shale revolution has had its own ups and downs, but regardless of fluctuations in supply and demand, we always need to move this stuff around.
To support this massive growth in oil and gas production, you need this suitably large underground network of pipelines to move those products to export terminals, to power plants, to refineries and petrochemical facilities. These are not small ventures. They're thousands of miles long just for one pipeline alone. They cost billions of dollars. They require massive permitting at the federal level.
And so it was that the shale revolution led to a pipeline boom. But that boom ultimately triggered an explosion of lawsuits broadly led by environmentalists. No project embodies the Herculean nature and divisiveness of this business better than the Keystone XL Pipeline. The Keystone XL Pipeline is like a diagonal line from the middle of Alberta down to Houston, Texas. It cuts through the U.S. states of Montana, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. A project of this scale faces varying permitting systems from state to state, as well as multiple run-ins with a host of conflicting interest groups.
The Keystone XL pipeline embodied a lot of the elements that pipeline opponents hated so much about the industry. It was massive, more than 1,000 miles long. It carried oil from the Alberta oil sands, which a lot of folks call tar sands because it's a particularly heavy grade of crude. It went through private land, indigenous land. It wasn't even carrying American oil and gas.
Keystone XL was a 830,000 barrel a day tar sands pipeline that would have expanded the dirtiest source of oil in the world for decades to come, a scenario that would have been inconsistent with a safe climate. And in addition to that, it would have had devastating impacts to indigenous communities in Alberta and communities along the route who rely on water sources threatened by the pipeline.
Proposed in 2005, the $5.2 billion project pressed forward with relative ease and with the cooperation of the U.S. government under the Bush administration.
The regulatory process under the Bush administration for base Keystone went very easily. It was all done within almost 2 years. The United States needed heavy oil. We had it to sell, and we were the pipeline conduit that was going to create this system that would create the greatest transportation economy for Canadian oil sands producers. So rather than sending it out on trains, trucks, this high volume direct link was going to give us the greatest transportation economy. This project became resisted by what I'll say basically the North American environmental movement.
The reality is there is no conceivable way that we can continue to use the same amount of oil we're using today without creating catastrophic climate impacts. The reign of oil has to come to a close if we're going to have a safe climate. And fortunately, we have the replacements and alternatives available today.
Environmental groups did win some victories under the Obama administration, especially when it came to the pipeline battlefront. In 2014, Obama vetoed a bill in favor of moving the pipeline forward. Then the following year, after 6 years of consideration, he decided to reject the project's permit outright.
The State Department has decided that the Keystone XL Pipeline would not serve the national interests of the United States.
Life has a way of surprising us.
What a great honor to be able to introduce for the first time ever anywhere the 45th President of the United States of America, Donald J. Trump.
Trump giving them a permit in early 2017.
Keystone Pipeline.
Legal interventions caused that permit to have to be reissued back in 2019. And it took that length of time before TransCanada and its shippers, who had to be reassembled commercially, started to construct the project in 2020.
The pendulum once again swung in the other direction when shortly after his inauguration, President Biden halted the pipeline's Phase 4 construction, which was to cut over 500 miles and run straight through a national landmark area in Nebraska called the Sandhills. But focusing their energy on the pipelines is often seen by people in the industry as misdirected activism.
This doesn't stop oil sands production. It doesn't stop Canadians trying to find other ways of getting that oil into the United States. But it does reduce the economic value of having lost the most efficient option that you could have resorted.
A major point that pro-pipeline advocates emphasize is, of course, jobs. And while it's true that killing a pipeline does result in a loss of some work, that might be a rather myopic definition of jobs.
As far as jobs, the industry has said that it would have employed over 10,000 direct jobs. Obviously, that would have a pretty big impact on certain communities and in certain circles where there are a lot of industrial workers. I think it's important to remember that these were not permanent positions. These were mostly construction jobs and pipeline development jobs on the ground. It's a little bit of a more complicated picture than I think the industry has made it sound.
There really are several different economic interests who were impacted by this. So there are the people like TransCanada Energy, and there are other partners in the pipeline, notably the Alberta government, the province of Alberta. They stand to lose somewhere, my guess would be on the order of $4 billion. All of that is kind of like the sunk cost of just trying to do the project. States that lose some of the economic benefits that derive from the project, such as property tax payments that literally would rank in the billions for states like Montana, South Dakota, Nebraska. Those states would also have benefited from the construction activity that would have occurred in their states that's lost. Tradesmen that had jobs working on this pipeline that don't exist anymore. The American refining interests, who were seeing value in running Canadian crude from a security point of view or from the fact that it just would work better than other sources, whether those were from Venezuela or Mexico.
President Biden's American Jobs Plan has earmarked $174 billion to win the EV market, and another $34 billion for solar, wind, and other alternative energy solutions. If this becomes a reality, the laws of supply and demand may drastically shift away from fossil fuels forever.
Biden's job plan is a really important foundational step in building an economy that's on the basis of clean energy and supports the just transition of workers from efforts to expand oil production, contrary to our health and safety, to projects that allow us to clean it up.
So if the end has come for mega pipelines in America, is the oil industry facing an adapt or die moment? Up next, we speak to one of the first major oil companies to shift away from the liquid that made them rich. This is Bloomberg Green.
This is Bloomberg Green. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in New York with your Green Brief. U.S. climate envoy John Kerry wants China to step up its efforts to reduce carbon emissions or put the world at risk of missing climate change targets. During a speech in London, Kerry said that without curbs by the world's biggest producer of greenhouse gases, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is, quote, essentially impossible. Bloomberg has learned that the world's biggest mining company is considering getting out of oil and gas. BHP Group has been in fossil fuels since the 60s and has assets in the Gulf of Mexico and off the coast of Australia. The company has until now insisted the oil business was one of its strategic pillars, but we understand it's now considering options, including a trade sale. $92 trillion. That's the latest estimate of how much governments and companies will need to invest by 2050 in order to prevent the worst effects of climate change. According to the research from Bloomberg NEF, spending on infrastructure for the energy transition will need to rise to at least $3 trillion a year. And more than 2.5 billion tons of food is wasted around the world each year. That's the estimate in a new report by World Wildlife Fund and UK retailer Tesco. The figure is almost double previous approximations, with farming in wealthier countries being a bigger offender than assumed. And that's your Green Brief. Kaylee?
Thanks, Jen. When Equinor changed its name from Statoil in early 2018, it marked one of the first big oil companies to publicly shift away from oil. It laid out a plan to become a net zero company by 2050 and performs better than peers on the majority of Bloomberg's environmental measures. But despite Equinor's clear shift in strategy, it was still labeled Norway's biggest greenwasher by a coalition of 5 environmental groups this year. Their criticism? The company is not moving fast enough. We're joined now by Equinor's Executive Vice President for Exploration and Production, Al Cook. Al, I guess the question is, why aren't you moving faster?
Well, I think it's a good question for the world. And in a sense, the world at the moment is not keeping pace with the pace of the rhetoric. We're seeing a lot of positive signs in terms of the world moving on from oil and gas to broad forms of energy and renewable energies. But this year alone, we're going to see an increase in demand of over 5% in oil as the world recovers from coronavirus. Last year, if you look, there was huge increases in gas imports into India and large increases of gas imports into China, even in the middle of coronavirus. Mm-hmm. So at the moment, demand is increasing fast and probably by most measures will continue to increase through the 2020s. So I think more needs to be done.
So you say more needs to be done. Where does that impetus need to come from? The private sector, like in companies like yours, or do you need to see more from governments as well?
I think we need to see everyone working together. Together is the key thing here. So at the moment, we're seeing demand go up and supply naturally follows that. So we need to work on both sides of the equation. The key piece here is that we need to address demand side, and we in our industry need to address the supply side. And the most important thing we're doing at the moment is if the demand for oil and gas continues to grow, continues to be strong, it's really, really important how we make that oil and gas and how we drive down the carbon footprint of that oil and gas. At the moment, for every barrel of oil that comes out of the earth, that generates around about 17 to 18 kilograms of carbon dioxide. In Equinor, we're down at half that. We generate about 8 kilograms of carbon dioxide, but we need to continue to drive that down. So that's one of the areas that our industry and our company can really help this. But it's everyone working together is the key.
So if oil and gas is still going to have a role to play, you need to try and make that cleaner or greener. What technology enables you to do so?
Well, the first thing we're doing is sorting out the emissions that we as a company create. So we're doing things like electrifying our platforms offshore. If you look at our flagship project, Johan Sverdrup, that's electrified using renewable energy, renewable power, and that now has a carbon footprint of less than 1 kilo of carbon dioxide per barrel produced, so around about 1/16 of the global average. We're also looking at ways in which we can take any carbon dioxide produced and bury that safely beneath the rocks. And we've been doing that on 2 of our fields, Sleipner and Snøhvit in Norway. And then just in the last couple of months, we've moved forward with a technology mostly found in onshore power stations. And we've taken that offshore to our Brazilian projects on a field called Bacalhau. And that's CCGT, combined cycle gas turbines. And that drives down the emissions associated with power generation offshore. So those are some of the examples of what we're doing around the world to reduce our own emissions. But the next stage will be to reduce the emissions of our consumers as well. The main way we believe we can do that is through the creation of clean hydrogen. Now, clean hydrogen addresses the challenges that renewables have around intermittency and around intensity. And when hydrogen burns, all you get as a product is water vapor, so you're not causing climate change. So that's really key. So at the moment, we're moving forward with hydrogen projects in the United Kingdom, in the European Union, and I'm really pleased to be able to announce that we're now moving forward looking at a project in the United States together with a great American company, US Steel, that's a huge consumer of natural gas in the United States.
Thanks so much to Al Cook, Executive Vice President for Exploration and Production at Equinor. And it's not just what oil companies produce that can have a negative impact on the climate, it's also what they leave behind. Up next, we investigate the abandoned oil wells in Texas that could be ticking time bombs. This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg's headquarters in New York, I'm Kaylee Lines, and this is Bloomberg Green. Well, what was once the fracking paradise of the Permian Basin in Texas may now be turning into a polluted nightmare. Dotted across the land are millions of abandoned wells, which could be ticking time bombs for local ranchers. We sent out reporter Sergio Chapa to one of those leaking wells.
We're here in the Permian Basin of West Texas, where some say this leaking well could be the sign of a bigger problem under our feet. This Chevron well was designed to inject oil field wastewater deep underground, and it did so for decades. It was plugged more than 25 years ago, but it started to leak the very same toxic water it was designed to get rid of. Chevron sent crews to fix the leak and find out what happened, but with other leaking wells and pipelines on the same ranch, the landowner and others fear an ecological disaster could be taking place.
I'm a fourth-generation West Texas rancher. My great-grandfather came out here in 1914, and we've been working cattle in West Texas ever since. The problem today is that we have a Chevron well blowing out that was previously plugged and abandoned. We don't know why it's blowing out, which is even more concerning than the blowout itself. We also have a number of other wells that are having various casing issues, pressure issues, etc. This is a symptom of the problem. This is not the problem itself. The problem is the other hundreds of wells on this ranch alone. Extrapolating thousands of wells in the Permian, tens of thousands. How many of those are going to collapse? Even if it's only 1%, that's 100 wells that are going to pollute aquifers and destroy huge swaths of land. Our water out here is at 53 feet, so any contaminants that get to the surface are going to get in our water system, and we live in a very dry climate. So if we lose our water, we don't have a ranch. People can't live here, cattle can't live here, nothing can live here. Right now, we are destroying this aquifer, and I legitimately don't know if it can ever be fixed. Like, it is a very open question whether any amount of money in the world can make this right.
What's happening here remains under investigation, but some fear it's the sign of a wider scale problem, one where hundreds or even thousands of old wells in the nation's most prolific oil field could also start leaking. Some say it could be a potential problem, one that both industry and regulators will have to deal with.
Let's bring in our big oil reporter based in Houston, Kevin Crowley, for more. Kevin, it all comes down to a matter of responsibility. Whose responsibility is it to clean up these left behind wells?
Well, in this particular case, it's clearly Chevron who operated the wells and drilled the wells and actually plugged the wells back in the 1990s. But this is a fairly rare case actually, because normally when big oil companies have squeezed the really profitable part of the oil fields out, they sell them on to smaller and less financially secure companies. So in this case, the ranch owner actually got lucky that Chevron, one of the world's biggest oil companies, still own these wells. But in many cases, the companies do sell assets on before the end of their life, and that does create a kind of a liability problem.
Well, while we're talking about these big oil companies, let's take a little bit of a step back here, because as we saw with Equinor, a lot of European companies are taking steps to dilute their exposure to oil and gas, and that isn't necessarily the case with companies in North America. What exactly is going on in the U.S.?
That's right. Well, the climate pressures are clearly growing in the US, but are nowhere near as strong as they are in Europe. In the US, the two biggest oil companies, Exxon and Chevron, have not made any commitments to reduce their production of oil and gas or even dilute that. They're still committed to producing oil and gas well into the future. What they have started to do, what they have done is announce various targets that seem to be sort of increasing each year, but are really seen as sort of well behind.
Well, even if the returns aren't massive, there is shareholder pressure, and we saw that with Exxon. I mean, just last year, you wrote a story about how they were going to increase their carbon footprint, and in comes an activist investor who says, wait, hold on a second, we don't want you to do that. And they now have a great deal more power on the board of Exxon. I mean, what's next for that company?
Yeah, I mean, we have, as you say, we reported that Exxon had a plan to increase their production by 1 million barrels a day, and we obtained documents that showed that that increase in production would have resulted in a quite significant increase in emissions, about 17% or so. Then last year, really Exxon, had been the poster child for criticism for their climate plans anyway, and. An activist investor came in right at the end of last year, and we've had a really tumultuous year this year when they've been trying to get other shareholders on board to try and get Exxon to beef up its climate plans and improve returns. And it was a remarkable event in May when shareholders actually supported the activist investor, and Exxon was forced to replace 3 members of its board. There's a quarter of its board were forced to be replaced.
So that's the story at Exxon, and let's compare and contrast it with some other players as well, because you have the likes of Conoco and Occidental who have announced a pathway to net zero. How do their plans compare to the rest?
That's right, they have. Now, they've couched these plans in terms like ambition and goal, but they have both declared sort of a pathway to net zero. In Conoco's case, from its own operations, not from those of its customers, by mid-century. Occidental has been slightly more ambitious, including Scope 3, that means the customer emissions in that, many decades into the future. And Occidental is building a direct air carbon capture plant in the Permian, which it sees as a real test case for how it's going to deal with its carbon emissions going forward. So there has been some movement on the US EMP, the independent oil producers side as well.
All right, thanks so much to our US big oil reporter Kevin Crowley in Houston. That's it for this week's edition, but keep the conversation going. Follow us on Twitter @Climate. I'm Kaylee Lyons in New York, and this is Bloomberg Green.